Welcome everyone. I guess we might have a few more kind of audience members sort of drift in the next few minutes, but I can just give a bit of an introduction and welcome you. My name's Steve Parks from Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. And this session is obviously part of the RSA Regions in Recovery Festival, and this is special session 24, which is accommodating connected and autonomous vehicles, understanding the challenges for cities. In terms of a little bit of context about the session and the topic, the impending prospect of a widespread introduction of connected and autonomous vehicles onto the roads means that there's an increasing need to better understand what the impacts of this disruptive technology might be and how we might accommodate it in the transport system. There remains kind of a lack of consensus in the literature about the impact of such vehicles on the built environment and on land use, the implications of this on other road users, and there are a number of challenges for cities and policymakers when navigating the rise of such vehicles, and I think particularly given the long transitional period involved. Now I'm really excited about the three speakers that we've got today, and they'll all be bringing different perspectives and evidence to the topic. First up, we have Iain Docherty from the University of Stirling. Iain's presentation is on contested transport futures, the case for public transport in the age of automated mobility. And then our second speaker will be Kelsey Oldbury from VTI in Stockholm. Kelsey's presentation is governance arrangements shaping driverless shuttles in public transport, the case of Barkarbystaden in Stockholm. Possibly butchered that, but we'll see. And then our final speaker is Ed Ferrarim from Sheffield Hallam University, and Ed's presentation is Connected and Autonomous Vehicles and Urban Spatial Structure, how might autonomous vehicles change labour and housing market accessibility for low income groups. So we've got three really interesting presentations and a generous couple of hours for the session today. So there should be plenty of time for questions. What we'll do kind of is try and hold the questions till the end to enable a bit of a kind of broader discussion amongst the panel and the audience. But if you do have a burning question or a point of clarification, feel free to raise this after each presentation, because I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate that. And kind of as normal now, if you want to pop your questions in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end, or you can raise your hand, I think, at the end as well. Yeah, so that's probably enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Iain now for the first presentation.
That's great. Thanks very much, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. As Steve says, I'm Iain Docherty. I'm from the University of Stirling in Scotland. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you about a research paper that we have currently under second review. I'd rather hoped it would be out by now so we could kind of circulate the final version to everybody. But what I'd like to do is talk you through a project which emerged out of this collaboration. And I'm sure that many of these people will be well known to colleagues. So the kind of coordinating mind here is Klaus at the Swedish Research Centre for Public Transport, K2, based in Lund. And Klaus has been leading a set of projects involving international colleagues for something like 3 or 4 years now, thinking about the implications of new mobility technologies, of which connected and autonomous vehicles or driverless cars, to use Glenn Lyon's shorthand, are perhaps the most urgent and largest component of that technological change. So we've got our colleagues from Australia, Clary, Crystal and John, and also my long-term collaborator, Greg Marsden from ITS Leeds. We all came together doing different pieces of work on the implications of cabs for the urban environment and the future of the city. And what you're going to see today is really a key question that emerged from some of our roundtable discussions on our individual projects and earlier collaborative work that we've done. And we realised very quickly that we had a common thread of interest, which is about how do we govern this change. And Steve's already hinted, I think, at the fact that even if how we manage the technologies at an end state is challenging enough, how we manage the transition from less automated mobility, because there's not none now, but less, to a future where there's a lot more automated mobility is really difficult. And what we were thinking is, where is the public interest in all of this, or public value? And so we've come up with a paper which tries to think through some of these issues. And I think it's important to say, and again, this is something that Glenn Lyons, for those of you who are involved in his driverless cars emulsion or have read any of his other writing on this subject so far, he's very keen, and I think rightly so, for us to identify what our kind of prejudices are as we go into this debate. And I suppose one thing that we should say is that we are all, I think, towards the sceptical end about the value of these technologies, at least in terms of the promised hype that producers say they're going to deliver for us. And that's a spectrum. I would probably characterise myself as further towards the sceptical end than most. But I think that's quite a useful position for people to articulate, because, as I'll come on to, so much of this debate has been about benefits, that we haven't begun to think about what some of the drawbacks might be. And in any implementation of sort of public policy change, that's clearly an important thing to consider. So, to kick off, what kind of challenges do we perceive that automation presents for this idea of the public interest or public value? Now, I'm sure that you'll know this quote probably off by heart or backwards now, I do. But this is Sergey Brin from Alphabet, Google's parent company. It's probably the most famous of the many kind of utopian positions about why we're engaged in implementing these autonomous mobility technologies at all. So the idea is that we're not doing this for the sake of it, but we're doing it because we're going to create what's public value. We're going to have less congestion. We'll turn the motorways into parkland. We're going to do without parking lots that blight so many North American cities, etc., etc. So our kind of starting contention is that we need a reality check on this. The current conceptions and articulations of what this technology is for are nearly all producer-led. And we'd argue they don't adequately, or in some cases at all, begin to consider issues of what the public interest or value in implementing them actually is. And then something I don't think I've got time to do today, but a literature that we've become really interested in thinking through is the whole set of case studies now that's about 20 years old on socio-technical transitions, which comes from the work of Frank Hales and others. And we would argue that we're at the start of one of those long and difficult and complex transitions. But the reason I make that point is that unless we start to think about these issues now, we might find ourselves in kind of path-dependent type processes as the transition unfolds that make it really hard to unwind what's already happened and to intervene to change the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. So as a kind of starting point, again, we'd argue that when you think about this debate, and particularly if you want to take a step back and think about what the public interest impact of autonomous mobility is, you need to think about what the proponents of autonomous vehicles really want. So the first task here is to look beyond the rhetoric that you see in that quote from Brin and much of the marketing language about these technologies and their benefits, and begin to think about what they will really do to the city. And I'm sure from Kelsey and Ed we'll hear a lot more about the actual practicalities of that. We would kind of argue that there's a utopian visioning exercise going on here. The focus of congestion and doing something about that, which is the kind of early focus of a lot of the rhetoric about CAVs, you can frame, I think, in this idea of being able to solve a wicked problem that traditional public policy interventions have not managed for something like 40 years now. And they kind of articulate the language of not just new technology, but of the market, and talk about improved efficiency and choice and a revolution, and the extent to which we're able to offer those two things as the key to unlocking this kind of transformative effect. Now, my polite way of describing that is that I think it's a really naive approach on what's about to happen, because the basic rules of capitalism 101 still apply. When you think about who it is that's pushing these technologies, they aren't by and large the traditional mobility or car companies, really. They're involved because they have technical expertise and they have branding and marketing experience, which the new entrants want, but the new entrants are the big tech companies. And these are probably the most powerful economic entities on earth. They are the big four. They are Google, they are Microsoft, they are Apple, and they'll probably be Facebook. So we're talking about a rather, I suppose, traditional argument here that these actors are entering the mobility market because they want to extract high rents and they want to become monopolistic, or more likely oligopolistic, in the way that the market behaves, indeed in exactly the same way that we see their now core business in information technologies and social media, etc., becoming. And the way that they want to do that, and the reason that these companies are interested in mobility, is not because they want to be car companies, it's because they want to capture our time when we are mobile and we're traveling, and they want control over that time and our mobility choices in order to monetize them. It's the attention of our eyes on the screen, and in its most raw example, they can't sell you stuff if you're driving a car because you have to look at the road. Now, the other thing I'd say, and I guess again that a lot of these studies are already well known to people that are active in this sort of debate, but the empirical work that's been done to date about the impact of driverless cars on the urban environment is really, I think, surprisingly negative in many respects. And this is a table from the first one of these studies, which is really the kind of, I suppose what you might call mother study, where a lot of subsequent work has followed the same methodology and tried to apply it to different city regions across the world. But this is the OECD ITF study of Lisbon and the modelled impact of autonomous mobility on traffic levels in that city, which was chosen because it's allegedly average in terms of income and size and transportation externalities for the OECD cities population as a whole, and nothing to do with the fact that chair of the ITF was Portuguese at the time. But nonetheless, let's take that at face value and say this is a kind of typical European city, for example. And if you look at these scenario assumptions, if you get to 100% shared driverless vehicles in Lisbon, the number of car kilometres doubles. So that's what efficiency really means. The system becomes so efficient that people use it to travel more. And that's even the same, of course, if we have 50% of capacity provided by these technologies, which is a kind of, obvious midpoint in the transition. So modelling work tends to suggest that this idea that we'll have immediate urbanism benefits from adopting this technology is at best optimistic. And this is quite a lengthy, but I think a lovely quote from another study, this time done in Oslo by their public transit authority, that replicated more or less the ITF methodology, but in obviously a more northern and much more prosperous and a substantially smaller European city. And effectively, they came up with the same outcome. They're talking here about mass as a system, mobility as a service rather than connected autonomous vehicles per se. But I don't think that distinction's that important here. But what they were saying, of course, here is that in the scenario where public transport becomes less competitive to these on-demand systems that become possible because of connected driverless cars, you get a lot more congestion and a lot more traffic rather than less. So that's why I made the point in the beginning about why we're sceptical, because we think it's a reasonable position for public policymakers who are trying to deal with this phenomenon to look very critically both at what the producer interests are telling them, but also what the early empirical work says about what the outcomes might be. So in our paper, we started to think about how we might articulate this, and we came across, and in reverse order, in time, but in the order that we thought about them really. This paper from 2016, so from 5 years ago, by Paget-Seekers and Tironi, which was set in Latin America, but that was the first mainstream academic article that we could find that really began to think through this concept of publicness and its different expressions at different scales of kind of political intensity as being a sort of analytical framework or a lens to start to think through the issues of how public interest might be affected by new technology. And really what it does is it articulates one of the classics from the political science literature, I think, which is John Dewey's work from the 1920s about democracy. So we define publicness in this way. It's the different manifestations of the public interests, and we define really the public interest as how government manages externalities. So if you go back to my kind of conceptualization of the big tech companies seeking to deliver this technology because it's a standard market entry rent-seeking behaviour, well, what's the standard response of public authorities to that? It's to manage the consequences of the change, and in particular to manage the externalities, because any new technology, for obvious reasons, doesn't have a naturally equal impact on space, place, or different communities within the city. And then what we tried to do was think through a slightly more refined version of that and think about, well, how do policymakers see the problem, almost literally? What are the levels of political visibility that all the different kinds of externalities and consequences of this socio-technical change might have? And we defined them, not having 4 levels like that 2016 paper did, but we reduced it down to 3, and we called it regulation and ownership, which is the most visible and the most common debate about the public role in the transport market, I suppose. Then wider questions of public value, so that's to do with effectively the socio-economic well-being of the city, and then our final level of the model, which is civitas, or the impact that these technologies have on our deep understanding and shared understanding of the city and its region as its citizens. And to do that, we drew on another really important paper, which is this idea about the way that political issues can be ordered by the extent to which they're visible in the everyday debate, effectively. And so the shorthand for this is that those elements of technological or social change that have the most attention by politicians in the democratic debate are not necessarily the most important or the most profound, but they are the ones which have the most impact on the business as usual and, by extension, people's everyday lives, I suppose. So we conceptualize this with our little drawing here of the iceberg. So we place public policymakers on the ship, and they're, as in the movie, looking out from the front to try and spot the iceberg. And when they do, what they see are those set of issues that can cause difficult political challenge that leads to their administrations losing their job, I suppose. It leads to democratic change. And they tend to be around this level of ownership and regulation. So it's about who controls public transport services, how much they cost, how effective the network is in serving different places, and what the experience is when you get on the vehicle. Now, every single one of those things will be very familiar to you, I imagine, as users of these kinds of services. If you open a local newspaper in just about any city in the world, and there's a story about public transport, those are the stories that you will be reading about. Open brackets, and cycle lanes taking away spaces from drivers, close brackets, but that's not the subject for today. So that's the everyday nitty-gritty of politics and public policy for the majority of people that are involved thinking through this stuff. So again, if you imagine you're Leonardo DiCaprio and you're looking out and you've seen the iceberg and you think you're going to hit it, and now you can see how big it is. You look just below the waterline and you see another set of tricky issues that you've probably thought about but haven't had the chance to do very much about because they're longer term and they're more complex and therefore more difficult to get sufficient political alignment to have policy change delivered. And they are the kinds of things that we write about a lot in the transport community. That's the kind of stuff you get if you open a transport journal, for example. It's about, well, what is the real contribution of transport and, by extension, technological change in the system to economic growth? What are we doing about carbon emissions or clean air or social inclusion? And these kind of non-transport issues, the ones that cut across different areas of public policy activity. So they're, kind of longer, slower burn, probably have a substantially more profound impact on functioning of a city than the everyday stuff, but there isn't always the bandwidth or the policy attention to deal with them. And then there's the stuff at the bottom, which hardly ever gets talked about by anybody in the transport debate, with a very few honourable exceptions. And that's often because they're quite fuzzy issues, but they're things like place quality and the concept and importance of public places and spaces, a bit of that in the contemporary literature. But how the extent to which we interact with one another through the transport system, and whether we actually come to the same places to be together because of the way the mobility system organises a city. That's really important in our shared understanding of what the city's for, whether we identify with one another as cohesive social groups, and how we exercise our citizenship. And the extent to which we think about these issues at all is very limited, but the way they are challenged by this technology is very profound. Very quickly to go through what we mean by those, I've kind of covered this, but just to make sure you understand what I mean. So in ownership and regulation, we're talking about the relative strength of the public versus the private sector, and that kind of battle about rent seeking versus regulation of externalities, and some key issues there that you'll probably be aware of, and which change with the introduction of cabs are safety. We can talk about the claims for increased safety made all day by the proponents of connected vehicles, but again, that's a really big subject, not one I want to particularly talk about. But a key issue that we've been thinking about is curb space becomes the new road space in this model, because the USP of connected or autonomous cars is that they are a genuinely hyper flexible door-to-door service, which means that you want them to be able to stop at exactly the origin and destination points of your journey. So the curbside rather than road space becomes the most contested for public resource in this kind of world. How do we price it? And we price the curb at the moment through parking regulation, for example, but in a world where there's more demand for travel because of these technologies, and everybody wants to be at the same place because congestion is demand concentrated in time and space. How do we manage that, and who gets to use the curb? And then, of course, there are all the issues about the extent to which public transport is financially viable in this world where there are so many Ubers around. And just to illustrate the extent to which you think that even things which are sacrosanct are up for grabs in terms of regulation already. Those of you in the UK might have seen this joint commission from the law commissions of England and Scotland that reported just before the pandemic, which came to this rather amazing conclusion that we would need to think through how we change the law to make it permissible for autonomous vehicles to push pedestrians out of the way, because that would somehow be required in order to realise the benefits that we're told we're all going to generate from this technology. Now, for somebody who likes to think of themselves as a militant pedestrian, and the fact that the city is a human scale that we can walk around and look at, I could talk to you all day about that, but I find that a really interesting example of a regulatory battle which you might not expect already happening. Then in terms of public value more deeply, there's the issue of what's called in the literature hyper choice, the fact that people who can afford to use a system can use it to go anywhere, any time. And this speaks directly to what colleagues will say later, so I'll just talk about it very briefly. To what extent will we get more congestion? Will we get more sprawl? What's the environmental consequences of that? What's the socio-economic consequences of that in terms of increased inequality of accessibility to employment, to education, to healthcare, to key urban services? And then, of course, if we remodeled the city, not just across space and physically to take account of these transport technologies, but also in our mindsets about, we leave our private homes in an on-demand private vehicle all the time to consume our leisure or other services in a private setting. What does that do to the viability of public services more generally across the city? And then our final level by Civitas. I suppose the main paper that we took inspiration here from is this one by Mimi Scheller in 2018, which again, you might know of, and that's the kind of next level of what I've just described about those profound socioeconomic impacts of the technology. So if our collective lived experience of the city is mediated by these technologies, and it's a kind of famous truism, I think, that when you look out the window of any building in any city in the world, what you see in terms of its built form is dictated by the transport technology that was dominant at the time. So I'm sitting here in that late 19th century house looking out at a street that still looks like it did because it was modelled on the tramway. And here I am, 150 years later, and it still looks the same. What will a city which is designed around the idea of hyper-choice, ultra-flexible autonomous vehicles look like? And what will the varied experience that then introduces as the transition rolls out? And again, before the pandemic, we saw this, the famous stuff in the American press about the algorithms of on-demand services and how they were racist. Let's be honest about it. in terms of the way that they mediated accessibility to the city. What does that mean if this becomes the main mode of public transport across the places that we live in? And a salutary lesson I think here is that we've been here before. We had all of these debates in the 1960s. This is a famous illustration from the Buchanan Report, Traffic and Towns from 1963 in the UK. That's, those of you who know London will recognise and probably know that that's an artist's impression of what Tottenham Court Road was supposed to look like in about 1990, where the car is king and every other mode is neatly compartmentalised into its own spaces. We know, of course, that we never had the money to deliver that vision, and what we got was lots of traffic and lots of concrete underpasses and none of the investment really in public transport to try and give a viable alternative. So history might not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And of course, the other sort of go-to quote here, I suppose, is the one of the many that I could have chosen from Jane Jacobs about what the impact of what was then a hyper-choice revolution. So the introduction of mass car ownership to cities, what it did communities and to communities, and we're probably, if we're able to roll out autonomous technologies quickly enough, at something of a similar point today. We call this a point of inflection. And that's because, and back to the producer interest point I started with near the beginning, we've got this kind of tension now between the richest companies in the world with a model of where they think their growth in revenue is going to come from for the next few decades through monetizing our mobility, versus a whole set of almost diametrically opposed policies which are about active travel, the importance of neighbourhood life, organising those neighbourhoods along walking and cycling and a 15-minute radius. The reasons that we should do that being about public health and about well-being and about mental health and about avoiding, if not the concrete underpass problem of the 1960s, what we might call a wall of metal of constant high congestion conditions all day long to meet that level of hyper demand that's envisaged in those models. So in other words, we argue we're at a point where we need to choose what do we want. Are we going to start to think about managing this process so that we can enhance our shared enjoyment of an identity with the city, in other words, do something to renew citizenship and the bonds between different social groups, or will we let hypermobility take over with all the negative externalities that we've seen? So just to wrap up, Steve, I said at the beginning it was quite a sceptical view. Sorry about that, but then I'd argue we have been here before. We went gung-ho to accommodate the car in urban environments for probably, 20 or 30 years now. We've now spent longer trying to undo it, with in most places very little success. So if we to avoid making the same mistakes again, we argue it's absolutely vital that we consider all these issues before we start to deploy these technologies in any meaningful way. And because I said at the beginning, that once we've started down this track, it'd be really difficult to unwind. I would have said now, but now is probably an elastic definition, especially given the impacts of the pandemic. But we probably are at or are about to come to a crucial moment where we need to think this stuff through and to set those path dependencies, or at least avoid the worst ones. And we'd argue we need to do that by thinking about how, to what extent, and for whom this technology actually improves public value. The empirical evidence or modelling, at least to date, says that that's not as clear cut as we might have believed, given the original marketing and proposition that was put forward by the proponents of the technology. So now's the time to think about it. And in particular, we really do need to think about these, to go back to our iceberg model, the below the waterline implications of these choices. We know they're really hard to get into the public debate. We know they'll be even harder to do, I suppose, because pandemic recovery will become everything once we come out of the public health crisis. But that, of course, I'd argue at least makes that even more important, because there's likely to be a kind of rebound narrative about where we have to build back better, and that means making the best and most largest use of new technologies. But we caution against that because things are tricky. I love this picture. This is a smart transport system. This is a big city. It's Strasbourg. You probably recognise it, where pedestrians and cyclists and public transport kind of works. It makes the place wealthy. It doesn't need smart technology. It certainly doesn't need autonomous vehicles. It just needs what you see in the picture, and at that point, some paper tickets. So, there is always lurking underneath these debates, I think, a kind of deeper socio-technical argument about the extent to which we're captured by the tyranny of the new, and something that we might want to take a step back from. So, as I say, we've got a paper which we're hoping to get out soon on this stuff. Meantime, lots of things that are already out there if this is of interest to you. Greg and Gillian and I kicked our thinking on this off for this piece in TRA a few years ago now. Greg and Louise Reardon at Birmingham then put together a really, really nice book of short chapters, trying to think through some of these issues from different perspectives. And I know that some of Kelsey's colleagues again in Sweden were involved in that. And the most recent book that I've had out with another of my long-standing collaborators, John Shaw at Plymouth, we begin to think through, and you can see from the cover, what the implication of not just these technologies, but other shifts in transport provision means for all the other aspects of public policy in the city that we're all concerned about. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Iain. It's fascinating talk. It's great to hear about the work that you've done. Does anybody have a kind of immediate question or clarification? If you want to just put your hand up or pop it in the chat. There was a question that I had. You were talking about kind of, well, I really like the way the iceberg kind of conceptualization of, and then you were talking about the not making the same mistakes again as we've done in the 60s. And I guess I was just interested how you think policymakers might be empowered to not make those same mistakes again. I don't know in the paper that's hopefully coming out soon, whether you've spoken to policymakers sort of around this topic and just sort of what their kind of the barriers they have and if there's anything sort of beyond the usual kind of challenges. Yeah,
that's a really good question, Steve. And we have spoken to some policymakers. That's kind of, I think, implicit in what I've said. And we don't report that directly in the paper because that wasn't the purpose. But again, more of that kind of information is kind of embedded in the text. I don't know. I suppose I kind of conceptualize a lot of this as the traditional debate about who gets the most out of the transport system on steroids. So we're all well aware that there is an increasing debate, that's grown pretty consistently over time about who it is that actually benefits from the money we spend on transport and who disbenefits. So in most cities, we've got a system which is dominated by private car and increasingly the private delivery vehicle. Every time you hit buy now on Amazon, you generate more traffic. And that means that we organise our public spaces towards those people who are better off, afford more cars, have more choice that they want to exercise. The disbenefits of that disproportionately fall on younger people, people on lower incomes, people in vulnerable groups, women who have more complex lives, than men because of caring responsibilities on the whole. This story is kind of well known, I think. And our collective inability in most places to do very much about it is also equally well known. And that to me just comes back to this idea that shifting the political status quo is really hard when politically important and dominant groups are the ones that benefit most. So that's a very long way of saying I don't know. But the most optimistic and sort of best reaction to this you see, I think, is or there are a few, aren't there? They're the way that young people kind of vote with their bikes or their feet and are driving less. And the way that the parts of the city that are younger are changing already to be less car dependent in most places. And it also, I suppose, depends on our colleagues in professional and policy making positions that they've got the kind of conviction of their beliefs to move ahead and try and implement stuff like car restraint in the 15-minute neighbourhood. And what we can do is we can provide the evidence and stuff to point to help them win that debate within their organisations, I think.
Great, thanks, Iain. There weren't any further questions at this point. We can move on to Kelsey next. So if Kelsey can share her screen, and yeah, remember if you've got any kind of questions for any of the speakers, just pop them in the chat and we can revisit them at the end.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it's not full screen, but we can
Is it full screen now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, Iain, and I look forward to hearing yours, Ed, too. My name is Kelsey Oldbury, and today I'm going to present an article that I've written together with a colleague, Carolina Isaksson, and we both work at VTI, the national state, the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute, and we're also affiliated with K2. And I would just like to add that the project that I'm going to talk about was actually part of one of the projects led by Klaus, who Iain referred to, who he worked with in his article, just to give a bit of the context of how different researchers maybe connect to each other. The article that I will present today really grew out of the branch of academic literature that Iain mentioned into the governance of the smart mobility transition and the specific questions that are being raised related to governance and planning connected to the development of these new kinds of technologies and services that are emerging at the moment. But this research was also, or it has also been grounded in a question of kind of what is currently going on the ground as kind of a parallel kind of discussion to have alongside these questions of how should this development or how should these developments be governed. So this research is kind of takes that perspective and has been specifically interested in the intersection of public transport and automation. And so the research has been quite exploratory, and the aim has been to kind of deepen insights into a specific collaboration and what we theorize as a governance arrangement in this case, and how the collaboration or governance arrangement shapes how automation is being introduced into public transport, and to really try to pay attention to the connections between new technologies and existing forms of transport planning, specifically public transport planning, and how kind of existing roles and relationships have structured these developments. And I'm going to talk about a specific case today, and the title kind of gave that away, I guess. It's called, so it's the research that this article focuses on is research into a specific project called Modern Mobility in Barkarbystaden. And I'm going to say Barkarbystaden a few times in this presentation, so I'll just clarify that it's an urban area under development. In English, it literally just means the city of Barkarby. But just to clarify. But this collaboration is between a private bus operator, Nobina, who is quite a dominant public transport operator in the Nordics, as well as Stockholm's regional public transport authority and the local municipality of Järfälla, which is one of the municipalities in the Stockholm region. But I thought I would just start by kind of going through two key terms or key concepts that this research builds on. And the first is, as I already mentioned, smart mobility. And here we also draw on Marsden and Reardon's definition from the book that they wrote on the governance of the smart mobility transition, and their use of the term smart mobility as more of a label to kind of group a series of innovations that are currently being rolled out or developing at the moment, including connected and increasingly autonomous vehicles, ideas about electrification, sharing, and often app-based or platform technology, as well as services such as mobility as a service. So within that label or within that group of developments, we specifically focus on automation and automation within public transport as one example of that. And the second key concept would be automation in this case. And we acknowledge that in our article, we acknowledge that automation is usually defined from quite a technological perspective in terms of how vehicles sense and interpret their surroundings and take over the driving task, usually performed by humans and often standardized into formal categories. But these categories of automation often don't really give any insights into the different contexts or settings the automation is being rolled out in. You know, it could be private autonomous vehicles you're talking about, self-driving car sharing, carpooling, and there's also driverless shuttles. And we refer to driverless shuttles in the article as one way to kind of clarify which area of automation we're discussing. And in the picture that you can see on this slide, that's one of the automated vehicles that was kind of launched within the pilot in Barkarbystaden for driverless shuttles. And it's one of the ones produced by the French company EasyMile, who's one of the dominant actors on the driverless shuttle software, or the software used in automated driverless shuttles. But moving slightly away from that more technological focus, we approach automation more from a socio-technical understanding in order to like move more towards situating automation within the kinds of governance and planning context that it's currently being rolled out in, and focus more about how we can situate that and understand it through the configurations of actors involved and the insights that that can provide us at this point in time. And if I move on now more to the specific case, I'll just give some more background information because the pilot that we discuss in this article is rolled out within the Stockholm region. And in terms of an institutional or an overarching institutional context, the Stockholm region covers 26 different municipalities. And within this, local authorities are responsible for, amongst other things, such as health and education. They're responsible for land use. So that includes, you know, urban planning. They have an urban planning monopoly on like housing construction, but also water and say infrastructure, questions around infrastructure. So that really intersects with the regional administrative level and their responsibilities for public transport planning across these 26 municipalities. And the specific municipality that's where the pilot we discuss in the article was rolled out is just to the northwest of the urban core of Stockholm city, as you can see with the little arrow pointing it out there. And there have also been two other key kind of background aspects to the development of developments happening within the case that I will talk about more specifically in the next slide. And one of those is a 2013 negotiation between national level actors, regional and local level actors. And this is specifically about the development of the metro lines in Stockholm, specifically the city center of Stockholm, that will be developed. And one branch will be developed in the northwest into the specific municipality of Järfälla, who will reciprocate by building a very large number of new housing units, about 14,000. So that's kind of a background factor. So the site where the pilot for automated buses or driverless shuttles in this case is the backdrop of that is the kind of intensive infrastructure and urban development process. And another strand that's important to mention are just national smart mobility initiatives happening in Sweden and kind of a buzz around developing different innovation programs where these kind of pilots are facilitated, such as Live Sweden, where a specific autopiloten project was developed and where actors in this case were previously involved. So now if I talk about the case in question, this collaboration kind of grew out of or was motivated by the possibility of developing both public transport but also new technologies against a backdrop of urban development. And as I mentioned, the project itself is called Modern Mobility in Barkarbystaden, and it was funded by the partially funded by the Swedish innovation like the funding organization Vinnova, and it's a collaboration between the private bus operator Nobina, the regional public transport authority for Stockholm, and the local municipality of Järfälla. And it also involves 2 innovation companies connected to the bus operator and the municipality, respectively. So many of these organizations are already established actors with formal responsibilities for public transport planning. But this collaboration kind of created a separate arena where they started to collaborate around new kinds of services. So you could see it as kind of an interface between formal responsibilities and kind of one of these more experimental arenas, which have been increasingly emerging in relation to questions around smart mobility. But within this collaboration, a number of different services were launched, a series of pilots around driverless shuttles, and that's what I'll focus on in this presentation and in the article. But it's also worth mentioning that a mobility as a service pilot was also launched, as well as a bus rapid transit line, which is supposed to simulate or emulate the future metro line. And I forgot to mention that even though I refer to these buses as driverless shuttles, there is a person on board, or a driver, so to say, who's still responsible for taking over in case something happens or the bus isn't able to kind of fully operate in its driverless mode. But I'll briefly just say something about the analytical framework and method to give just a brief insight into that. But the analytical framework we used was focused around planning literature and previous studies that have tried to explore new spaces of planning, because it seemed like a very relevant theme for developments happening in relation to automation and smart mobility. So we understand planning from a much more processual, a much more kind of relational understanding of planning, and use the soft spaces discussion to kind of inspire a discussion of these what have been described as in-between spaces of governance, and governance spaces which have been said to emerge as kind of complements to formal planning processes. But in order to focus our analysis more clearly on governance, we don't use smart spaces, but we use the term governance arrangement to more clearly, conceptualize and focus on the governance aspect of what's happening in this case. Methodologically, I was kind of inspired by organizational anthropology, and was able to participate in meetings that were set up as part of the structure of this new collaboration, as well as kind of take part in, for example, the launch of these autonomous shuttles in Barkarbystaden. And then this was combined with semi-structured interviews with representatives from the organizations involved. And I should say that this research took place before 2020, in between 2018 and 2019. And the structure of the collaboration itself was kind of inspirational to the methodological approach, which focused around the actors involved in the project group, as well as the specific working group for automated buses. But if I move on to an overview of the empirical findings from this case, in the article, we discuss four different aspects of this case. Firstly, the role of the underlying procurement contract for public transport in this area. Secondly, the public transport authority's expectations regarding innovation in public transport and how this intersected with the bus operator's role and their interest in developing automated technology. And thirdly, kind of the role of innovation companies in this case and how they start to intersect with more established roles that the organizations in this case already have, as well as what shapes and connects the driverless shuttles to the other services in this collaboration. So if I start with the procurement contract, Nobina, the bus company involved in this case, actually already has the contract for more ordinary public transport, in this case that was established in 2016, so before this new collaboration started. So it was kind of a key underlying factor for, maybe why it was that specific company that is part of this collaboration. But in terms of where automation comes into that, there were no plans or there's nothing in the formal contract about automation. Instead, it was more the influence of urban development in the area meant that the contract was written in a way that it was flexible enough that it would maybe be able to respond to the changes happening as a result of that intense urban development. So a section was included on the possibility to carry out new projects and services during the contract period. And it was this that was kind of used as an entry point to pilot driverless vehicles within public transport, or motivate them in connection to this existing public transport contract that Nobina has in the area. So in the article, we discuss how this case kind of illustrates the ways in which formal governance and planning tools connect with the development of smart mobility and how they are starting to interact with each other in this case. The second area that we discuss is the relationship between the public transport authority and the operator. And this is obviously very much influenced and characterized by their business relationship through the procurement contract. And here we note that in the field of smart mobility, it's often the kind of new actors that often take up a lot of attention, and it's often there that is like a dominant focus is placed, as well as on how public actors will respond to that. But here, this case kind of highlights how existing actors within public transport are trying to negotiate these new kinds of development, and how in this case automation intersects with ideas about where innovation should come from within public transport. So in the case of the Stockholm region, it was clear that the Public Transport Authority anticipates and expects that innovation comes from their public transport providers. But here now the automation comes into that arena. It's clear that that kind of role and connection to automation is transferred to the role of the bus operator, and how it's their role, or an example, or this case provides an example of how an already established actor within the public transport sector starts to try and develop their role in relation to automated technology, but that's made possible by the intersection of how both they and the Public Transport Authority kind of construct ideas about who should drive innovation in their relationship with each other. I also mentioned innovation companies and the ways in which these connect to established organizations. So in this collaboration, 2 innovation companies were also involved alongside these more established actors. And it was quite clear that the municipality established their innovation company to kind of flag that they were open and interested in testing innovation during urban development. Whereas Nobina Technology had been established for slightly longer. They'd already started to try and develop and test these autonomous vehicles kind of in this separate company. So in this collaboration, it was an opportunity for the bus operator to connect this, or connect the developments that had been initially happening within their innovation company to their more ordinary role, to start to kind of move automation more close, or to move automation closer to their existing kind of processes and responsibility for public transport. So the bus operator's role is just very dominant in this case. And this is also kind of shaped by the service package that was developed for this collaboration. So the image here you can see, I'm sorry that the text is in Swedish, but this was one of the plans, or one of the images that was released when this collaboration was established as part of press material, and it shows the dark blue line shows the developments of the bus rapid transit line, and then around that you can see that the buses are supposed to dot around what is going to be this new urban area. So this relationship between a more high capacity public transport line provided by the bus rapid transit service was also a key aspect of motivating the role of these new smaller automated buses in this area as kind of a last mile service, which would complement these more ordinary or services which would carry more people. So this also kind of highlights how the role of the bus is kind of changing within public transport, and how the operator is clearly trying to kind of develop a service offering that kind of covers these different aspects, and how this also highlights maybe the operator's role in this case kind of is shifting to a more strategic position, that it's their thinking that's kind of pushing forward these developments in motivating driverless shuttles in relation to other forms of public transport. But to conclude and kind of draw those different strands of the analysis together, on an overarching level, in the article we discuss how, in this case, it's very clear that the wider institutional context really characterizes how driverless shuttles start to be connected into public transport planning, and that there it's really the use of the formal contract that is key in the way that the pilot for these was able to be motivated by a service within public transport, even though it kind of exists within a kind of limbo between, it's not subject to the full regulations that ordinarily public transport would be, but it's still kind of presented as a service developing within public transport. The case really kind of emphasizes the role of the bus operator, and really raises the question of, what is the significance of the operator's role in kind of pushing or in kind of setting a specific trajectory for the development of automation in public transport. And this maybe is an example of a pilot that's happening in a specific context, but it obviously has implications for the kind of role this technology has within both the operator's broader work, but how then that's mobilized in their discussions with public transport authorities in the future. I don't know what it's like in maybe a British context, but in Sweden, there's a very strong emphasis on collaboration in these kinds of projects, and collaboration kind of as something that happens neutrally across different actors. And this was quite a key aspect that shaped this case, but it also highlights that, collaboration isn't something that means that all of these actors are on the same level or have the same interests, but instead approach and enter this collaboration from quite different points of departure when it comes to automation. If we think about, say, how much this pilot is clearly driven by the operator themselves. So here, this case really emphasizes, smart transitions, they don't evolve onto a blank slate. It's very much about how they connect to existing relationships and roles of existing actors as well. Looking forwards, we discuss how while it's possible to acknowledge that a period of testing is necessary, maybe to decide and learn about these kinds of new technologies, public actors need to consider how to move beyond a role of opening up for these developments. And there I really thought about your comment in the beginning, Steve, about navigating the development of automated vehicles, and how, in this case, public actors were very involved in this pilot, but they had more of a role of opening up for these developments and not necessarily setting a strategic agenda or pushing a strategic agenda on an overarching level. So because of this, we discussed kind of the need for a more clearly articulated policy and planning agenda, so that developments related to automation don't just happen within pilots, and public actors really start to think about who represents whom in these developments. Because, for example, if we compare, say, the municipality and the regional actor with the operator themselves, the bus operator doesn't have the same public responsibilities as the municipality and region, for example. But thank you for listening, and there's a link to the article included in this presentation there. I can stop sharing.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. It's really interesting to hear about that work. We've got a chance for a couple of questions now, if anybody had one. I did want to ask about, I think I understood it right, that the shuttles on the map that you showed, the shuttles were kind of for the last mile as part of the BRT as well. And I just wondered where kind of active travel comes into it as well. So like walking and cycling, and whether that's kind of also recognised as a solution to the last mile. I was just wondering whether that's maybe a function of the fact that it's the bus operator given the responsibility and the power, so they're going to pursue the shuttles rather than kind of pushing for walking and cycling. I didn't know if that was, and then you mentioned at the end about the operator not having the public responsibility, and I just wondered whether if the responsibility was with the transport authority, whether the picture might look very different in terms of how the different modes interact and are integrated.
Yeah, no, because in terms of walking and cycling, this is those kinds of infrastructures in this area there's quite maybe a large question mark over them, because it's still under considerable development. But there is an ambition that this new area should be very close to public transport. But yeah, I guess there was this ironic, I don't know, you could say that the specific line that these buses trafficked is more, you could question, how much is it for fulfilling a need, or how much is it to fulfill a need to kind of test a new technology. And in terms of, walking and cycling, I would say that not enough maybe people, because the area is under such intense urban development, I think those questions haven't really settled in terms of, existing structures for that, because things will change so much in the coming years. And in terms of the last point I made about public responsibility, it's obvious. It's not that I was more trying to flag that the bus operator ultimately doesn't really have the same responsibilities, because they are still, in terms of ordinary public transport, they're still procured through the region. But in terms of driving the development of smart mobility, you can question, why or how does that responsibility, where does that responsibility lie within these developments? If it's being driven by a private actor, and how does that intersect with kind of these more overarching public responsibilities that exist kind of outside of this pilot context. It's like, it seems like there's often issues of thinking about the scale of when it comes to these issues. Obviously, often there's a focus on more small scale within pilots, but they often have much larger scale implications depending on how the development happens. So I don't know if that helped clarify. I know it's quite a complicated case, so I hope it wasn't too much of just like an onslaught of information, but
no, thank you. There was maybe one more question from Susan in the chat, I think for Kelsey. Does the public know the reason they changed the space? I don't know, Susan, if you wanted to kind of elaborate on that, or if you're happy with that, Kelsey.
Oh, hi, thank you for letting me ask the question. I lived abroad, and when they changed the area, which was very nice, I asked somebody, why are they always changing the space in Helsinki? And someone said, well, we don't know, but the bus stop would move, or there was a tunnel brought in. And really this changed the weather. Where we lived, the tunnel in the area, I thought was a disadvantage because it made it more windy. Anyway, it's just a thought. And I don't know if that's connected to Stockholm, but it is in that region, Nordic region. Thank you for listening.
yes,
And thank you for the presentation.
no, thanks for the question. I would say that in this case, the public is very aware that they're living in an urban area that's under intense urban development. It's quite a clear, I think it's quite, it's one of the municipality's main priorities and projects at the moment. So I would say those move into the area are very aware that they're moving to a location that will be quite affected by, construction, etc., for the next 10 years, as kind of a result of ideas about, the need to build more housing in the Stockholm region and improve this, underlying metro infrastructure, if that clarifies the developments. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. So we'll move on to our final speaker, Ed Ferrari. I think, Ed, if you want to share your screen and yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Apologies, hopefully everybody can see that. Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks very much, Iain and Kelsey, for great presentations. A really hard act to follow, but I think there are connections here, with some of the messages that we've been getting from both of those previous presentations. This is a presentation that's motivated not primarily from a transport perspective per se. It's motivated, I think, by an interest in access to labour markets and the role of urban structure, housing markets, policy, and yes, transport on some of those gradients of accessibility to labour markets. And of course, that sits alongside other social and economic factors that determine things like outcomes in the labour market and accessibility. But it's really from that sort of labour market accessibility point that we're beginning here. Certainly this is primarily drawn from a piece of work that wasn't motivated in any way, shape or form by the emergence or the problems associated with connected or autonomous vehicles, but actually sort of housing and labour market and economic development coordination challenges in a particular part of England, which I'll talk about. But I do think it's sort of quite instructive to take projects like this, which are about broad urban systems, and think about how CAVs might disrupt and sort of play out in those contexts. So, sorry, I'm just advancing the slide. So the outline briefly of the next 25 minutes or so is starting from this premise that the impact of calves will play out on, you know, what's already a very heterogeneous, very unequal terrain, and sort of really responding to that call there, that the attention to the potential impacts of calves on different parts of the city is relatively sparse. This point, I think, is a point that Iain maybe made as well. So this presentation will use a case study of the Leeds city region, which I'll define very briefly in a moment. Firstly, to look through some of the, and apologies if it sounds a little bit like an urban history lesson, but the long-run spatial development of houses, jobs and transport in this sort of fairly ordinary city region in many ways, albeit one that is, well, notorious, famous in the transport world for two famous reasons. I guess Greg Marsden and colleagues are, you know, of that area. And secondly, as policymakers and the public do like to continually remind us, it's the largest urban area in Europe that doesn't have anything sort of resembling light rapid transport or you know, any kind of sort of public transport network beyond buses and some suburban rail. So looking at that long run spatial development and then thinking about how transport and accessibility to jobs plays a significant role in the production and reproduction of social inequalities. And then really in the kind of second part, or the concluding part of the presentation, to begin to perhaps hypothesize some first and second order impacts that the eventual widespread adoption of calves might have when played out on that terrain. But bearing in mind, I think some of the, you know, and it was Steve that mentioned this really at the outset of the session, the timescales for this are quite uncertain and could be quite drawn out. But I was also struck by Iain's point that if we just leave, you know, if we wait too long to allow this story to unfold, the path dependencies kick in. So there's absolutely a critical need to begin to foresee some of these impacts now and think about how policy, at least, and perhaps action begins to address these. So I'm going to rewind 70 years or so. 70 years of economic, social and spatial change in an area like the Leeds city region. The Leeds city region, as its name suggests, is a broad functional economic area that surrounds the city of Leeds, which has a population very roughly of around 800,000, making it one of the larger local authority areas, second only to Birmingham in England. Obviously, London's a different case in point, has a different sort of set of governance arrangements, and a wider functional economic area comprising of 10 local authorities, which you can see on the map there, with a population of just under 3 million or so. So a reasonably significant functional economic area, and depending on your social and economic status, either a highly fragmented and differentiated housing market or an integrated housing market. But obviously that depends on your own resources and transport resources amongst them. It's important to recognise that the south west 5 local authorities on that map comprise what's called West Yorkshire, and that West Yorkshire since last month has been designated as a mayoral combined authority. So it now has a directly elected mayor and to some limited extent devolution of some powers, and that is also coterminous with the public transport authority in the area. So this is a functional economic area of 3 million, but the public transport authority really only has competence over 5 of those 10 municipal local authorities. And I think the story and indeed the prospects of the sort of coordination and certainly culture of model of cooperation that Kelsey talked about that might come naturally in the, you know, in the Stockholm, greater Stockholm context would be quite different, I think, and perhaps there'll be some sort of evidence of that coming through. But just a quick sort of potted history in a way. The spatial development, particularly the economic development of this terrain, has seen successive identifiable waves, and I guess very crudely we would point to the original role of Bradford, Calderdale, and Kirklees in the industrial revolution of providing a kind of western flank of water-powered economies that really generated the initial wealth in this part of the world. Before, particularly in the 20th century, in various different phases, right up to kind of mechanization and modernization post-war and nationalization, the opening up of coal fields and the transition to a kind of economy that was much more linked to extractive industries, and shifting the geography and that arguably shifting the economic focus of this area more to the east and to Barnsley, Wakefield, and Selby, and then more recently, I guess, and there's no obviously sharp cutoffs between these, but more recently the re-emergence, I suppose, of the importance of Leeds as a preeminent financial services and professional services centre, but with the real kind of rocket fuel under that happening in the 1990s. When Leeds is kind of well known, but Leeds financial and professional services sector really started growing, and that arguably kind of leading to a growth pressure out to the north and to the east in particular. And at the same time, you're seeing the kind of strengthening of at least the strengthening, not necessarily particularly in a traditional agricultural sense, but the strengthening of areas associated with the rural economy and tourism, particularly to the north of Leeds, and the provision of the emergence of those areas as a very desirable commuter belt servicing York and Leeds, or the kind of so-called Golden Triangle area. So the key point here that successive waves that have been associated with distinctive eras of housing development and associated with those different forms of transport. I'll not go through each of these, but I think some of the identifiable eras of housing market development associated with that story. It's not been a continuous, but a sort of, I guess, a kind of more of a staccato pattern, but include the development of significant pre-1919 terraces at the core of most of the major settlements, then a significant wave of interwar housing, both in terms of the first wave of major municipal housing developments in central districts, and also cottage-style council estates on greenfield sites ringing these original core areas, together with private suburban developments in what would now be called middle ring suburbs, places like Chapel Allerton to the north of Leeds. With sort of parallels there in terms of kind of transport helping to open those up, like sort of Metroland area in Greater London. A post-war phase of large new planned peripheral housing estates, a big expansion of the suburban footprint of Leeds and Bradford, as well as York, albeit that much more hemmed in type of area, as well as systems built high-rise estates. And I think importantly also in this post-war period, some other development archetypes, like significant development and expansion of the coalfield towns, Wakefield and Barnsley, and also the growth of other towns which are now particularly desirable, like Harrogate, for example. So I think if initially the dominant transport modes that were sort of enabling the connection between this housing development and the economy and the labour markets that they were serving were originally around active travel, and then suburban rail and trolleys, and then a mix of different modes, but particularly kind of nationalisation of bus services, the emergence of obviously of the car and the kind of traffic in towns and Buchanan era that Iain spoke of earlier. And then I think two significant periods worth talking about more laterally, late 20th century development, periods of significant private house building in the 70s and the 80s, leading to new estates across the Leeds city region, infill between the extents of the existing settlements, together with a sort of parallel process of urban regeneration and renewal on the kind of, particularly on the municipal sort of estates that had fallen into a bit of disrepair. And then post 2000s, and I think particularly associated with the urban white paper and other policy developments, since we see a kind of renaissance, an urban renaissance, and particularly in central Leeds and a bit later along the lines in Bradford, characterised by large private flatted complexes and particularly the emergence of purpose-built student accommodation in cities like Leeds and Bradford. Medium to large-scale brownfield development sites with substantial new communities, major regeneration projects on large former council estates and tenure diversification, so new private housing, new greenfield housing, and so-called sustainable urban extensions. And if I'm allowed my little moment of, cynicism, certainly the question in the sustainability of that model in a variety of places, and also, as I will go on to talk about in just in a moment, some examples of consciously and blatantly infrastructure-led suburban expansion at quite a significant scale. Importantly, really many of these latter developments, perhaps with the exception of the urban renaissance archetype, really being predicated on the car. So I talked about Wakefield a moment ago, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Wakefield, not to pick on it necessarily, but as a local authority, I think it sort of almost unashamedly said it was going to go pro-growth, and largely seeing the expansion of its eastern flank by opening up new roads infrastructure to service hitherto inaccessible sites and make them attractive to private developers. And if ever you sort of wonder what's the impact of that type of activity, and I just think we've seen it in Wakefield over the last decade to a greater extent than perhaps others, but it's a type of model that's been followed throughout England in particular, and indeed the Homes England, which is a national kind of regeneration and housing growth agency, runs a particular fund called the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which effectively pays for roads, basically, to open up greenfield sites, and that's effectively what it does. So if you're ever wondering about what the impact, you can see it quite clearly when you look at migration, significant shifts in migration induced by new housing supply. So whereas on an annual basis, Leeds used to lose around about 320 households, people, this is persons, per annum in net terms, so obviously flows in both directions, from Leeds to Wakefield, but by five years later, and this is sort of broadly as the kind of majority or the bulk of that new housing supply kind of come on stream, that increased to a net loss from Leeds to Wakefield of around about 2,000 or so. So quite significant, and that wasn't just a one-off based on choosing particular years, and you can kind of see net migration from Leeds just absolutely skyrocketing over that period. So housing development within the functional economy does lead to significant migration effects. Now, of course, I don't have data to present here, and on necessarily where all of those new occupants of those housing were coming from, but that's an important part of the story. and where they work, and that's obviously an important part of the story, but we might hypothesize about some of those things. And the reason why I think we can have some confidence about hypothesizing some of these things is that we know particularly over the last 2 or 3 decades, but it's been a long run process, that jobs have been decentralizing, but on a selective basis, and crudely put, we've seen a kind of shifting and sorting of where jobs are, and higher paid, higher status jobs have centralized to some extent, or they've certainly focused on central Leeds, and they're now to an extent central Bradford, and on areas that are well connected to those, particularly on the rail and motorway networks, and accessible to them. And so these are the proportion of jobs that are in any given statistical area. It's an MSOA, which is in one of the higher socioeconomic classes, as measured by the ONS. And then if I just sort of flick the slide and contrast that with the lower socioeconomic classes, you can see a sort of significant difference. Now, this hasn't showed change, but there are maps also that show that this is a process of ongoing change and consolidation. So effectively, low-income jobs and the sorts of industries and sectors and occupational types that they're in are largely decentralizing spatially onto business parks, or have been for some time, onto more out-of-town retail type developments, and consolidated public services as well. Whereas, just flicking back to the previous slide, jobs in knowledge-intensive business sectors, creative, and other kind of higher socioeconomic occupations have been tending to centralise a bit, particularly as a conscious result of our urban renaissance policies. And I guess there are two associated problems that's worth bearing in mind. And one is that transport costs are not felt. The burden of transport costs is not felt equally across all sections of society. A particularly obvious point, perhaps, but there's quite a clean inverse relationship between the amount of money that average households spend on transport and what they spend on housing when you look at it across income. So the poorest 10% spend a lot on housing, a lot proportionately of these are the orange lines, a lot proportionally of their weekly expenditure on housing and associated costs like fuel and power, and comparatively less on transport. And the opposite is true for the richest 10%, and a relatively clean gradient between those. And then I think the second problem there is that the spatial structure of employment and the outcome of those maps that I showed you a moment ago have actually served to work quite insidiously against those on lower incomes, for a way that I think requires a more nuanced understanding of the spatial mismatch hypothesis that urban economists have sort of tended to talk about, in that I think policymakers have sort of tended to fall into the view that, well, if we've decentralized low-income jobs and we have a significantly decentralized population structure as well, isn't that a good thing? Well, actually, it doesn't work like that. Where a household lives heavily determines access to employment, and arguably more so for those on lower incomes for fairly obvious reasons around resources and the ability to afford transport. So that's the previous slides really. The map of employment is very significantly varied across space, but and there have, as I've mentioned, has been a long-standing trend in the decentralization of lower income occupations. Poor households, effectively, who live in more peripheral areas are constrained to only very local job opportunities. So there may be tons and tons and tons of jobs in logistics parks and retail parks and so on in the peripheries of our settlements. But if you are on a low income, you can really only access those that happen to be on your doorstep, not the totality of all of those jobs. And that's a very different experience to those that have mobility resources, particularly when those jobs have been pre-pandemic, centralizing. a few more slides on things like public transport accessibility. I mean, this is from work that's been done by Jeroen Bastiaansen. Very recently published a really good paper on this in Urban Studies. I think it just came out a couple of weeks ago. Definitely worth having a look at that, because again, it's based on micro data in the Leeds city region. But it is just worth remembering that if you are constrained to public transport, that the most accessible neighbourhoods have an aggregate accessibility to jobs that's over 10 times greater than the least accessible neighbourhoods. And, you know, and that's a very different magnitude of difference to those that might be on, that might have access to private car. And I think it also partly explains the concept of forced car ownership that, you know, others in the transport sector like Mattioli have written about, and others. So I'll just skip that, but it's a kind of sort of different sort of slide about accessibility if you're able to drive. And I apologize for cheekily sort of trying, I just thought, can you try to capture the sort of problem in an image? And I think it's this in a way, because Krispy Kreme and others like them, you know, Krispy Kreme have plans. I mean, this was 3 or 4 years ago now, so they'll be well along the road with this, plans to open 800 of those sorts of things across the UK. And it's obviously a very car-based development model, but it's moving to where the customers are. So to synthesize so far before I get into the kind of CAVs bit, if I've probably run out of time totally, Steve, I'll just kind of try to canter to this as quickly as I can. Profound economic changes in the nature and location of production. Transport innovations throughout history have both reflected and enabled this. So too have patterns and priorities of public policy and investment in housing in particular, but also economic development and transport. Matching decentralised jobs with the population does not necessarily lead to increased aggregate accessibility. So reconfiguration of the social relations and capital and increased spatial segregation of income is a clear outcome of this, and transport can be a barrier rather than an enabler to employment. And I think that's a sort of position that policymakers need to remember. So within that, and very briefly, and this is obviously the much less well-developed part of it, what might the hypothesized impacts of CAV uptake, whether that's over a year or 5 years or 10 years or 30 years, be? I mean, clearly there will be a number of first order impacts. And I think some of the literature, and Iain talked about this, probably, you know, picks up on some of this, and there's some emerging empirical evidence, but clearly increased road capacity through mechanisms of reducing headway between vehicles, increasing junction efficiency, and various other, you know, technological benefits, if you like, of CAVs will dramatically increase vehicle miles travelled. And there's another reference there, and you know, Iain talked about a couple of studies earlier that show that doubling in different contexts. Dependent on software and algorithms, you know, leaving vehicles to their own devices may redistribute traffic onto secondary routes, onto distributor routes, precisely to enable some of these efficiencies and to get that capacity uplift. And that means more traffic on residential streets. Shifts in governance and cultural attitudes, firstly to accept and then to understand and then finally to embed, is always a process of technology transition, and the governance aims of enhancing public value will be critical to those outcomes. And so this is just a reminder that the speed of the technology transition will be critical to how those social externalities can be managed. And I think it is worth also just bearing in mind that CAVs could also increase the efficiency of public transport or shared modes potentially, although I would have a degree of scepticism about that for reasons if we have time, we'll maybe pick up in discussion. For housing markets then, I mean, some maybe fairly obvious and fairly facile points, but you know, if associated with electric drivetrains, it could initially raise demand for houses with private access to charging, private driveways, overcoming the distance penalty by making car time in the car more productive, could further help to, particularly aligned with post-COVID changes to the workplace and a more hybrid approach to work, could further decentralise housing demand. Pressure for suburban, the resultant pressure for suburban and peri-urban development in smaller settlements will result. And I think the Wakefield example shows that sometimes that can be actually courted as much as anything, but it's certainly the current planning system in England somewhat emasculates planners' ability to actually control those development pressures. And I've talked about forced car ownership. That may rise, but it may be more difficult to sustain for those on lower incomes that are likely to be locked out of the kind of CAV revolution in the early years. For transport, again, that efficiency and the more intensive use of the highway network and/or the routing thing could all decrease the permeability of urban space to those on other modes. It could increase the competition between public transport, on-street public transport, and vehicle movements. It would certainly seem to me a fairly obvious outcome is that there would be more competition between active users and CAVs in the absence of anything else. Being able to multitask will diminish the marginal productivity premium associated with public transport. So making CAVs more attractive than public transport, all other things being equal. If these vehicles can self-park, where will they park? They may find parking in uncontrolled inner city areas, which are basically other people's residential areas, and may increase vehicle movements in those areas. And then finally, for labour markets, the improved journey times and productivity during the journey, enhanced digital connectivity in the vehicle may help to rebalance the trade-off for workers that they currently face in determining their residential mobility patterns, that trade-off between travel time and the housing amenities that they can enjoy through the labour market. And if we kind of rebalance that, it potentially pushes further suburbanisation. Any reduction in public transport and/or a more hostile environment for active travel will disproportionately impose barriers to employment for those that rely on those. And automation may undermine a significant and growing source of labour for those on low income. So let's not forget that it won't just be personal mobility that's affected by the CAV revolution, but distributional mobility as well, logistics, which are major growth employment sectors at the moment. So some tentative conclusions: CAVs may use the existing infrastructure, but they have characteristics which suggest that they could significantly affect the supply of personal transport. Those first order impacts will be on how the existing infrastructure is used more efficiently, but it will be in the second order impacts, some of which are very speculatively outlined, through changing the space-time calculus, which is inherent in the housing, labour, personal transport decision-making, that the most profound impacts will be felt. And hypothetically, there are at least several ways that the impact on housing and labour markets specifically could plausibly lead to much higher levels of social spatial inequality than even those that we see within urban systems presently. And that's likely to be harmful for the labour market participation rates amongst those on the lowest incomes. Okay, sorry, Steve, that took a little bit longer than I had hoped it would. Apologies, everybody.
Thanks, Ed. We're still comfortably within time. Thanks very much for presenting that. I think some really important points raised and questions raised as well through that. Yeah, so we've got a little bit of time. So if anybody has got any questions, welcome to raise the hand. Ed, I think you did raise a question at the start for Iain, if you wanted to ask that, or if you wanted a quick breather, I've got a question as well. Sorry, I feel terrible because you've just heard my voice for over half an hour to then follow up with a question. So I'm quite happy. I'll come back to it. Okay. In which case, Sally popped a question in the chat, although that was actually for you. So we'll hear you sooner than we thought. What are your feelings on the understanding of this context for policy decisions on transport and related infrastructure, and what can be done to better inform them before decisions are taken?
It's a great question, Sally. I think maybe I'm just being too kind. I think Iain's iceberg was really, really helpful in understanding this, and I agree that there's lots of the kind of DiCaprio field of vision, we'll probably now forever call it. Seeing that those kind of ownership and regulation issues, and perhaps if the water's clear enough, they might see some of the public value use stuff. Maybe I'm being a bit overly kind in a way. I think sometimes the water is clear enough for them to see a little bit under the surface of that iceberg model and see some of the public value questions. But I am very, very pessimistic on the coordination prospects really to overcome some of these things. So I think a clear message is the need for cooperation and coordination on matters relating to housing and economic development, and seeing those as inherently spatial planning practices that work across boundaries. And I know it's a fairly obvious and old-fashioned point to make, but the powers that have followed the mapping, so I think there's been really good work to recognise functional economic areas and how labour markets and housing markets work and interact across metropolitan areas in England. And then we've had some rhetoric about having economic development, housing and transport policies trying to match those. And then I think it's kind of fallen apart again, and I don't see the prospects being particularly strong. And that gives rise to the Wakefield problem, I think, because it really is just each local authority and set of political leaders that maybe are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, sort of out for themselves, really, and causing all sorts of problems that sort of arise from lack of coordination. And I think it's because, so if you think of your Wakefield, and I mention him by name, but sorry, Peter Box, but if you were Peter Box and you were the leader of Wakefield Council, you are starstruck by the ability to get thousands of jobs in logistics and light manufacturing along the M62 on new business parks, and you are starstruck by the ability to create thousands of new homes using money from housing, whatever they're called, sorry, it's just gone out of my head, Homes England, and the DFT to open up significant land in the east of Wakefield. You're starstruck by that, and you think it's a good thing, but actually it's not. It really desperately is not a good thing. It's not to say that we don't need houses, of course we do, and we do need jobs, but we need to think very carefully about who can access those. And it's not the occupants of that new housing that's accessing those new jobs, despite them being, in the bigger scheme of things, quite close together.
Thanks, Ed. Iain, I'm not sure if your question might have been linked to Ed, so I didn't know if you wanted to ask that first, and then we'll come back to Will.
Thanks, Steve. I wanted to kind of agree furiously with a lot of what Ed said there in his reply, but just to add some other things which I think are important. So we forget just the extent to which local government has been hollowed out in two ways over the past, well, particularly since 2008-9, when in England, what's the average local authority's budget's down by what, 45% on 2008 or something in real terms. I mean, extraordinary levels of cuts that people forget about. So one, monetary resources are really scarce, but secondly, they've been professionally hauled out in terms of skills for decades, really. And in places like West Yorkshire, since probably the local government reform of the mid-80s, which is now what, 40 years ago. So it's almost impossible in some locations for any pushback to that political incentive that Ed talks about, because some authorities just want growth at any cost, frankly, and that's what you see. The UK is not alone in that, I have to say, and you can find that in even some of the most allegedly enlightened places in Europe. It's quite a salutary lesson to look out the train window from a car on the southern edge of Amsterdam, for example, and ask what 50 years of all that planning legislation really did, because it doesn't really look very much different. So that's a problem. Another problem is that we still got almost no local tax autonomy in the UK. So attracting this kind of housing development is really important for these kind of authorities, because it diversifies their demographic base. It it makes their tax base more sustainable in terms of attracting families who are likely to be middle or higher income for the region and likely to pay a bit more council tax. And so there's a whole set of financial gearing considerations that work there. The final thing I'll say, though, is that it's just possible that we're witnessing a really strange inversion of some of this stuff happening in England as a kind of unintended consequence of the levelling up agenda and the political focus on these kind of communities as a target for the Conservative government for votes. So those of you in the UK will have read all the stuff about the Red Wall and the Hartlepool by-election recently, and the fact that, you know, in these kind of communities that Ed talks about, you can have a modern detached house, 2-car lifestyle and quite a low salary, actually. And people think that's a good quality of life. But the flip side is there's a real response to housing growth, negative response beginning to happen in the south of England. So today there's another by-election where it's entirely possible the Conservatives will lose because of an organised local campaign against two things: housing development and high-speed rail. So there's all kinds of bizarre and perverse local political incentives that are, I suppose, Ed, another slide or two that you could have put across on top of that presentation just to demonstrate how complex this all is. And, you know, if you're a politician that wants to say to somebody, I'm sorry, you shouldn't have your 2-car lifestyle that means you can go to Krispy Kreme at any point that you want, you know, good luck getting re-elected.
Thanks, Ian. Will, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks. Well, one of my questions is kind of been covered about kind of whether public actors, public authorities have the kind of tools and resources and skills to kind of be able to act strategically. But I think we've answered that. And then Ed, when you were talking about the potential Peter Box response, it just struck that it completely mirrored an actual quote I have in a piece of work I've been doing recently about investment, and this is around low carbon transition. So anyway, I just thought that was funny. My real question was, and it is for any one of you, all three of you, to me, it feels this isn't really, and certainly not the potential negative consequences of some of these developments, aren't really on the agenda for the public or publics in different forms. And that's kind of an issue, I guess, because especially when if the agenda is captured by, as Ian was telling us early on about the technology firms and all the rest, and lack of public understanding around some of that. So so my question is, how do we kind of, or is it possible to bring different publics into the debate in order to shape that debate in different ways?
Kelsey, did you want to pick that up?
I can try. I think, for example, in an anthology written by Klaus, who Ian mentioned earlier, and another colleague, Alexander Pausen, one of the conclusions from an anthology they wrote about that was focused on policy instruments and smart mobility was that within policy and governance literature related to these kind of developments, there's very little that approaches kind of populations as publics with kind of rights, voices, and roles within this development. Often pilot projects they may claim to be citizen-centric, but they often kind of maybe include citizens as passive users or recipients of technologies, even as barriers or as mainly consumers. So I think the iceberg that Ian showed really kind of highlighted exactly where citizens are within maybe this overview of like what's happening. And I think I would say that this is slightly connected to how many of these, at least I would say that many of these developments are rolled out in pilots, and that's often as an excuse not to include publics that are often included in other kind of planning processes, in, you know, kind of deliberative planning process. So it's as if those are kind of spaces of exception that don't really, that don't necessarily, like, it's often this market perspective, I would say, that's very dominant, where people are supposed to be users and not citizens. So the public is, there's a big question mark around that. now I've rambled on a bit, but I don't know if Iain or Ed, what would you say?
I had a chapter in that book that you mentioned, Kelsey, where I did a long rambling think out loud or write out loud answer to that question. So I mean, I'm kind of a student of governance, right? So I think unless you get the governance arrangements right, you're going to struggle to get anything done. I can probably, in a live action moment, reach to my bookshelf, and apart from having an RSA book there, I'm a big fan of this piece, which is written by Joseph Convitz. He's a really good friend of mine now that I worked with a long time. Joseph was head of the OECD's Territorial Governance Division for about a decade, sort of around 2000. And the TLDR of this book, which he wrote when he retired and kind of reflecting on the financial crash, was that cities and regions could do things that national governments can't, because they have and Ed, you talked about this and kind of like right sizing the institutions that you use to try and do things, but they also have a different kind of politics and a different kind of legitimacy sometimes than the national government, which is too concerned about other stuff and the complexities to get stuck in. So Joseph in that book writes, I think, very persuasively about the potential for effective cities to be the best agents of change in all of this stuff. And I think there's a lot to that. And in there, well, the West Yorkshire case is going to be a fascinating example, because it's moving towards this kind of mayoral, more interventionist model of governance, which has been commonplace in other European cities for longer and seems to have done Greater Manchester good. The other answer I would give Steve, well, I've got the floor as it were, is that a lot of this stuff is just an expression of the big meta politics that we find ourselves in. So what we've talked about here, and I think particularly what Ed's described in the UK context, which I know well, I know Stockholm much less well, Kelsey, though I know it's got its own kind of core city and suburban municipalities politics thing going on, which colours a lot of the context for that case that you talked about. But in the UK, at least, we've created this political economy where we just keep giving more and more money to people who've already got it. And people that have already got it tend to be older and have housing equity and live in particular kinds of places that Ed talked about and have particular kind of lifestyles. And so we've created this politics for ourselves where we just have to, the governing parties have to just keep chasing after the same group of people all the time, who happen to be the ones that have got the most carbon intensive lifestyles, and then reproduce the whole kind of stuff that Ed explained. So I've no idea how you crack that, actually. I mean, I think that's the big problem that we've got about intergenerational justice and resource allocation. And at some point, I fear that's just going to go bang, and it'll affect all the areas of public policy, not just transport.
I couldn't agree. Couldn't agree more. I really, I think it's a sort of cultural battle. I mean, maybe it's not a battle. It suggests that it's sort of that the forces on either side are A, identifiable, and B, equal or reasonably equal. And I don't think that's the case. But there's a kind of set of cultural and attitudinal tensions, and I think Iain sort of talked about those in terms of the politics of it. But I think there's a set of sociological frames that we can approach this through. I mean, sociologists they'll know it much more richly than I do, my slightly superficial understanding of sociology, but there is a seam of work around elective belonging, which I always come back to. I find really, really useful. This sort of idea that individuals, can subscribe into lifestyles and then can use that to rationalize all sorts of kind of behaviors. And if the danger is that we're not politicians, and politicians have to chase the votes here, so we can afford ourselves to have a bit of smug elitism about this, but actually that's the sort of challenge in a way. But if we're going to be smugly elite about it, we can be quite disparaging of the two-car lifestyle and the battle for the right to consume the Krispy Kreme in your kind of air-conditioned vehicle. And And part of it is that we've just created those opportunities and we've made them look attractive, and then people subscribe into that as a sort of lifestyle, and then as the kind of housing development apparatus and machine and the political apparatus and machine just reproduce that. But also, I can't help reflecting that sociologically, maybe across class, maybe this is not just a class thing or an income thing. You know, there are those that are enamored with, quotes, progress, modernity, technology, and kind of equate it with aspiration. And that will drive them into the CAV future. It will drive them into CAVs. It will mean they'll buy CAVs, and they'll buy them or they'll lease them. They won't share them with people. I don't see that happening. And so, you know, it will become the latest in a long line of technologies that many will aspire to. Some people will acquire them very, very easily, and others will really have to sort of work and or scrimp and save or whatever, but they'll get into them, and others won't, you know, but that's a sort of, I think, a kind of, you know, different attitudes towards so-called progress or modernity and technology. I was sort of struck to make that point when Iain talked about paper tickets in Strasbourg, you know, and you know, the death of cash and all of the other things that are happening just now, which have big social impacts, and the digital divide and all of those things, but they're inexorable, you know, they're unstoppable, really. So as policymakers, I don't know what you do about that.
Did you want to add something, Iain?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, again, more furious agreement. There is this, you know, I know you probably guess by now I'm a total cynic in just about everything, never mind the matter at hand here, but there is a terrible dash to do something just because it's there. And CAVs strike me as possibly the ultimate example of a solution looking for a problem. I can't get my head around at all about why we actually want these things. Because we don't need them for safety, because we can use a lot of the other technologies which are embedded in them, but are not actually the automation part, you know, the whole Vienna Convention levels distinction between different component technologies in them. We can accrue most of the safety gains simply by adopting those and slowing everybody down a bit for pretty much no economic damage. But you know, the extent to which we must have technology for the sake of it, there is no better example of this than ticketing in transport. So if you think about how much work has gone in by all the tech companies and every transport authority in the planet to make this into a ticket, you know, and the best examples of this are actually poorer cities in the Mediterranean. You go to somewhere like Naples, there's what, 100,000 outlets. Every little kiosk and corner shop, open 24 hours, can sell you a ticket that gets you instant access to the entire network. It's worked like that since about 1900. And yet we still can't make these things do the same thing. And my takeaway from that is that's because we don't need to. That's because the simple technology that we have and we understand well is really easy and it works. You know, so you know, if I've got a bundle of paper tickets in my pocket or my wallet because they've cost me €1 each, that's smart. It's not high tech, but it's smart. And that then leads you into a whole set of further discussions about, you know, well, what happened in 2008? Obama saved the car industry, not because we need cars for transportation, but because it's a huge sector of the economy. And you could also argue that, you know, governments are chasing autonomous vehicles because they're seen as a tool of economic development and export tech-led growth and nothing to do with transport at all. And there's certainly I think a compelling case that that's what's happening in the UK. But yeah, that's enough cynicism from me. I'll shut up.
Thanks, Iain. Conscious of time, but I think we'll have one final question for us.
Yeah, thanks. But I think it was sort of Iain kind of answered it, unless there's a different answer. And it was just listening to you all. Is there a kind of a positive vision for CAV? Is that, you know, one that works to address the kind of societal challenges or transport challenges we have?
Yeah, regulating them very, very tightly and negotiating some use cases where we're all agreed that they are genuinely useful. And they do exist. because there are some final mile trips. I mean, very like the kind of model that Kelsey showed actually, about where if we think of them as part of a wider multimodal network and we deploy them sensitively and in a very limited way, you can make them do things that other modes can. And they particularly can give you out of hours access to locations that you'd never be able to justify a conventional service. You can make them work in rural areas, often very easily, particularly when there's very little traffic to start with, and the costs of the driver are simply the reason why there is no public transport available. So I think they can work really well in some particular kinds of geographies and places. And finally, they do probably make it easier for particular groups in society to access what they need to do in a way that traditional public transport can't. And the most obvious example of those are older and mobility impaired people, because the well-designed autonomous vehicles, well-regulated, will give you a kind of continued motorized access, which for many people is really difficult to do by even a high-quality conventional bus, especially if they live in a rural place where there isn't one and they have to give up driving themselves.
Great, thanks, Iain. Good to finish on a positive note. So we'll draw it to a close there. I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers today. I thought all the presentations were really interesting, and really good discussion as well. So yeah, just thanks again, and